They did not lower their voices when they spoke about Clara Whitfield, and it seemed that her own blood had turned against her, until a lone cowboy made a promise no one expected. She stood at the edge of the yard where her family had lived for generations, her hands folded tightly in front of her, not because she felt calm, but because she had learned that visible fear only encouraged people to explain why it was deserved, and the words that reached her were not accusations so much as conclusions, spoken by voices she had trusted since childhood. Her uncle said her presence was becoming a problem. Her aunt said the town was starting to talk. Her father did not defend her, but did not accuse her either, which somehow hurt more than anger, because silence from blood carried a heavier verdict than any shout. No one named the crime clearly, yet everyone spoke as if it were obvious, weaving fragments of rumor into a story that sounded complete only because it had been repeated too many times to challenge. Clara searched their faces for hesitation, and found none, only the tired certainty of people who believed that protecting a family sometimes meant sacrificing one of its own. And when she tried to explain that the story was not true, the words felt small in the open air, dissolving before they reached anyone willing to listen. The neighbors gathered at a careful distance, pretending not to stare while memorizing every detail. And Clara felt the familiar sensation of being known without being understood, her life reduced to a version that fit the town's fears more comfortably than her reality. At the edge of the crowd stood a man she had seen only a few times before, a lone cowboy who had ridden into town weeks earlier, quiet, weathered, unnoticed because he had never tried to belong. And while everyone else watched her with judgment, he watched the people judging her, his gaze moving slowly from face to face as if measuring not her guilt, but their certainty. When Clara's mother finally spoke, her voice trembled not with rage but with resignation, saying that sometimes love meant letting go. Clara felt the ground shift beneath her feet, because she understood that the decision had already been made in conversations she had never been invited into. The cowboy stepped closer then, not toward Clara, but toward the space between her and her family, and though he did not speak, his presence disrupted the rhythm of agreement just enough to make the crowd hesitate. Clara met his eyes for a brief moment, and saw no pity there, no curiosity either, only a calm attention that felt dangerously rare. And as her father turned away without meeting her gaze, she realized that her own blood had already chosen its side, while the only person who had not spoken yet was the one man who did not owe her anything at all. By the next morning, the ranch felt unfamiliar, as if every fence post and wooden beam had been quietly reassigned to a story in which she no longer belonged. And Clara moved through the yard with the careful steps of someone who understood that every glance toward her carried judgment even when no words followed. Her aunt avoided her eyes while folding laundry. Her younger cousin stopped speaking when Clara entered the room, and her father busied himself with the horses as if work could erase the need to explain himself, leaving her surrounded not by anger but by distance, a punishment more precise than shouting. Outside the gates, rumors traveled faster than truth, shaped by mouths that had never asked her a single question, and Clara heard fragments carried on the wind. Whispers about disgrace, about impropriety, about something that had happened when it should not have. Yet when she confronted one neighbor directly and asked what she was being accused of, the woman's expression tightened and she turned away, saying only that some things were too shameful to repeat. The words landed heavier than any insult because they suggested that her guilt had already been accepted as fact by people who could not even define it. In the stable, Clara found her mother standing alone, hands resting on a wooden rail, eyes fixed on nothing. And when Clara asked quietly why no one would tell her the truth, her mother's answer was not cruel, but exhausted, explaining that sometimes families chose silence because naming a problem made it real, and that reality could destroy everything they had worked to protect. Clara realized then that the secret surrounding her was not about justice, but about preservation. A fragile agreement among people who believed that losing one daughter was preferable to risking the family's reputation. As she stepped back into the yard, she saw the lone cowboy again, leaning against the fence where he could observe the house without being noticed, his hat pulled low, posture relaxed yet deliberate, and when their eyes met, he did not look away as others did. Instead, he held her gaze long enough to signal that he was listening not to the rumors but to the absence of facts behind them. Clara felt something shift inside her, not hope, but awareness, because she understood that while her family had chosen to protect their name at the cost of her voice, the only man who had no reason to care was the only one who seemed unwilling to accept a story that could not explain itself. And in that moment, she sensed that whatever truth had been buried beneath the town's whispers was not only dangerous to her, but far more dangerous to those who were determined never to let it be spoken aloud. By the third day, Clara Whitfield understood that exile did not always begin with being forced out. Sometimes it began with being left alone in the middle of everything, surrounded by people who had already decided she no longer existed in the same way. The ranch continued its rhythms as if nothing had changed, horses saddled, fences repaired, meals prepared, but every movement now carried an invisible boundary that stopped just short of her name, and Clara felt herself moving through familiar spaces like a guest who had overstayed a welcome no one had openly withdrawn. She was carrying water toward the stable when she noticed the lone cowboy again, standing where the dirt road bent toward the hills, his horse tied loosely to a post, his posture unhurried, yet his attention fixed not on the land, but on the house behind her, as if he were watching something others had chosen not to see. When Clara passed him without speaking, he did not follow, did not call out, but moments later she heard his footsteps behind her, slow and deliberate, keeping a distance that felt intentional rather than cautious. He spoke only when they were far enough from the house that no one could overhear, asking her quietly whether anyone had actually told her what she was accused of, and the simplicity of the question struck her harder than all the whispers she had endured, because it forced her to admit that no one had. She shook her head, her voice unsteady as she answered that everyone spoke as if the truth were obvious, yet no one dared to say it aloud, and the cowboy listened without interruption, his expression unreadable, as if her words confirmed something he had already suspected. He told her he had seen towns like this before, places where fear wore the mask of honor and silence passed for wisdom, and that when people refused to name a crime, it was usually because naming it would expose their own involvement. Clara felt the weight of that idea settle into her chest, not as comfort, but as danger, because if he was right, then the story being told about her was not just a misunderstanding. It was a shield protecting something far larger than her reputation. As they walked back toward the stable, Clara noticed eyes watching from windows and doorways, not hostile but alert, and she realized that the cowboy's presence beside her had already been registered as defiance, not friendship. Before they parted, he said one more thing, quietly, almost reluctantly, that he did not make promises easily and never without reason, but that if her family chose to cast her out without proof, he would not stand with them, and the words did not sound heroic or dramatic. They sounded final. Clara watched him walk away toward his horse, feeling the ground beneath her shift in ways she could not yet measure, because she understood that the moment a stranger chose to doubt the story her own blood had accepted, the town would no longer see him as neutral, and whatever promise he had not yet spoken fully was already beginning to draw a line that neither of them could step back across, without consequences they had only just begun to imagine. The promise was not made in front of the town the way stories liked to imagine such moments. It came quietly, in a place where no one was meant to listen, and that was what made it dangerous, because words spoken without witnesses carried consequences that could not be undone by denial. Clara Whitfield found the cowboy waiting near the edge of the pasture at dusk, his horse grazing loosely, the sky fading into a pale strip of gold behind the hills, and she sensed before he spoke that something in him had already been decided. He did not ask how she felt or what she planned to do, because he understood that questions often sounded like permission to retreat, and instead he told her what he had learned since arriving in town, that the rumors about her were too coordinated to be accidental, that the men who spoke the loudest about honor were the same men who avoided detail, and that her family's silence was not proof of guilt, but evidence of fear. Clara listened with her hands clasped tightly at her sides, because hearing someone else name what she had felt but could not articulate made the situation feel both clearer and more frightening, as if the ground beneath her feet had finally revealed how narrow it was. The cowboy hesitated then, a rare pause in a man who seemed accustomed to certainty. And when he spoke again, his voice was low and deliberate, not dramatic, not loud enough to travel beyond the pasture, yet heavy enough to change the shape of everything between them. He told her that if the town forced her to leave, he would leave with her, not as rescue, not as charity, but as a choice, and that if her family turned their backs, he would stand where they refused to, even if it meant becoming an enemy of the people who paid him, trusted him, and tolerated his presence. Clara felt the words land slowly, not like comfort, but like weight, because she understood that promises were rare in a world built on convenience, and that the kind he had just offered could not be withdrawn without breaking something fundamental. She asked him why he cared, why a man who owed her nothing would risk everything for a girl whose own blood had already judged her, and his answer was not romantic or sentimental. He said that he had learned long ago that silence was the most expensive lie a town could tell, and that he had promised himself never to stand beside it again. As they walked back toward the ranch, Clara noticed figures watching from the porch and the fence line, their faces unreadable, and she realized that although the promise had been spoken in private, it was already being sensed in public, because the way the cowboy walked beside her now was different. Closer, firmer, unmistakably chosen. In that moment, Clara understood that her family's betrayal had created a void, and into that void a stranger had stepped not with anger or pity, but with a promise no one had expected. And she felt with sudden clarity that from this point forward, whatever happened to her would no longer belong to her alone. Because the moment a lone cowboy chose to stand against blood, the town would no longer see her as a problem to be ignored, but as a conflict that had finally found a witness willing to fight its silence. Clara Whitfield understood it the moment her father asked her to come inside the house, because people only used gentle voices when they had already chosen not to change their minds. The kitchen felt smaller than it had ever been, the walls closing in with the weight of generations that had lived there without ever imagining a day when one of their own would be discussed as a problem rather than a daughter. And as Clara stood between her parents and her uncle, she felt the strange clarity of someone watching her life from the outside, aware that whatever was about to be said would not be undone by tears or explanations. Her uncle spoke first, listing the consequences the family was already facing. Neighbors withdrawing, business slowing, whispers growing sharper. And his words were not cruel, but practical, which somehow made them more dangerous, because practicality left no room for mercy. Clara tried again to ask what she had actually done, but her mother interrupted softly, saying that sometimes innocence mattered less than perception, and that a family survived not by proving every truth, but by removing what threatened its stability. And in that moment, Clara realized that the accusation against her was not about facts at all. It was about convenience. Her father remained silent until the end, his eyes fixed on the table as if looking at her would force him to admit something he could not afford to name. And when he finally spoke, He did not accuse her directly, but told her that the town would never forget what had been said, that even if she stayed, she would always be watched, always questioned, always doubted, and that leaving quietly might spare everyone further harm. The words sounded like advice, but Clara heard the truth beneath them. She had already been chosen as the sacrifice that would keep the rest of the family intact. Outside, she saw the cowboy through the window, standing near the fence where he could not hear the conversation, but could sense its weight, and the knowledge that he was there did not comfort her as much as it frightened her, because it meant the promise he had made was about to be tested sooner than either of them had expected. When her father told her that she should pack only what she could carry and leave before nightfall, Clara felt something inside her finally fracture, not in pain but in understanding, because she saw clearly that her own blood had drawn a line she was no longer allowed to stand behind. She walked out of the house without arguing, her hands steady, her expression unreadable, and as she stepped into the yard where the cowboy waited, she did not cry or plead or explain. She simply told him that they had decided she no longer belonged there, and in the quiet that followed, she felt the weight of exile settle not on her shoulders alone, but on the space between her and the man who had promised not to walk away when blood had already done so, knowing that the next step she took would not just change her future, but force him to prove whether a promise could truly be stronger than family. She did not leave the ranch immediately, not because she hoped her family would change their minds, but because the weight of what had been decided needed time to settle into reality. And as she stood in the yard with a small bundle of clothes in her hands, she felt the strange sensation of watching her life detach itself from the place where it had begun. The cowboy did not rush her or tell her what to do. He stood beside his horse with the same quiet stillness he had shown since arriving in town. Yet his presence carried a tension that did not belong to him alone anymore, because everyone on the ranch understood that the moment he chose to remain near her, he was no longer neutral. Neighbors began to gather at the fence line, not openly hostile but alert, drawn by the unspoken drama of a family expelling one of its own, and Clara sensed that her departure was being measured not as tragedy, but as correction, a necessary adjustment to restore balance. When her uncle stepped onto the porch and announced that Clara would be leaving by sunset for her own good, the words sounded almost compassionate. Yet Clara saw the relief beneath them, because her absence would end questions that no one wanted to answer. The cowboy stepped forward then, not aggressively, but decisively, and asked in a calm voice what proof existed of the accusations being whispered about her. And the sudden silence that followed felt heavier than shouting, because it exposed how fragile the story against her really was. Her uncle dismissed the question as irrelevant, arguing that reputation mattered more than details, that a family could not survive endless doubt. But the cowboy did not retreat. He said quietly that a town that destroyed its own children to protect its comfort would eventually have nothing left worth protecting. And the words unsettled the crowd, not because they were loud, but because they were difficult to argue against without admitting cruelty. Clara watched her father's face as the exchange unfolded, hoping for a flicker of hesitation, but saw only fatigue, the expression of a man who had chosen stability over justice and could not afford to reconsider it now. When the cowboy finally turned to Clara and told her that he would leave with her if she wished, his voice carried no drama or pride, only certainty. And in that moment, Clara understood that his promise was no longer private. It had become a challenge to the town's authority and her family's decision. Murmurs spread through the crowd, some accusing him of interference, others warning him that standing with her would make him an outsider forever. Yet he did not respond to any of them, keeping his attention fixed on Clara alone, as if the rest of the world had already been weighed and found irrelevant. As she nodded slowly, accepting his offer without gratitude or apology, Clara felt the final boundary between herself and her past dissolve. And as she walked toward the road beside the man who had chosen her over blood, she realized that the true danger was no longer exile, but the storm that would follow when a lone cowboy proved that promises could be stronger than family ties in a town built on silence. They had barely reached the edge of town when Clara Whitfield realized that leaving quietly had never truly been an option, because towns built on silence did not forgive those who exposed it, and the moment she walked beside the lone cowboy instead of behind him, she felt the weight of eyes following them with a new kind of intensity that had nothing to do with curiosity and everything to do with control. The dirt road stretched ahead like a narrow promise, yet behind them the ranch remained visible, solid and unmoving, a reminder that what she was walking away from was not just land, but a system that had shaped every person she had ever loved. The cowboy did not look back, but Clara sensed the tension in his posture, the subtle shift of a man who understood that walking away could sometimes provoke more danger than staying. And when she heard footsteps on gravel behind them, her instinct was not to run, but to turn, because fear had already taken enough from her. Her uncle's voice reached them first, calling not her name but the cowboy's, accusing him of poisoning her mind, of turning a private family matter into public defiance, and the accusation revealed what truly frightened him. Not Clara's departure, but the example it set. The cowboy answered without raising his voice, saying that no family had the right to exile one of its own without truth, and that protecting reputation by destroying a daughter was not tradition, but cowardice. And the words hit harder than any insult because they named what everyone had avoided admitting. A small crowd gathered quickly, drawn by conflict the way people were drawn by storms, and Clara watched faces she had known since childhood harden with unfamiliar expressions, some filled with doubt, others with resentment, because her decision forced them to confront their own silence. One man stepped forward and warned the cowboy that interfering in blood matters had consequences, that outsiders who challenged family order rarely found peace in towns like theirs, and the threat carried no violence, only certainty, which made it more chilling. The cowboy did not respond immediately. Instead, he turned to Clara and asked quietly whether she wished to continue walking, and the simplicity of the question felt revolutionary, because it was the first time anyone had asked her what she wanted instead of telling her what was best. When she nodded, the cowboy faced the crowd again and said that her choice had been made, and that anyone who wished to stop her would have to explain why silence deserved more protection than truth. And as murmurs rose and then faded, Clara felt the strange realization that loyalty in this town had never meant standing with what was right. It had meant standing with what was familiar. As the crowd slowly dispersed without acting, not convinced enough to intervene yet unwilling to admit they were wrong, Clara and the cowboy resumed walking, and she understood that something irreversible had happened, because by choosing him over blood, she had become a living reminder that obedience was not the same as justice, and the town that had once shaped her identity would now see her not as a daughter who had failed them, but as a threat to the fragile order they had built on never asking difficult questions. The truth did not surface dramatically, with confessions or confrontations, but through a series of small details that refused to stay silent any longer, and Clara Whitfield felt its presence before she understood it, like a shadow that had always been there but had finally begun to move. By the time she and the cowboy reached the abandoned barn at the edge of the valley, night had settled into the land with a quiet heaviness, and in that stillness, Clara sensed that the story told about her was beginning to crack in places where no one had expected pressure. The cowboy had not taken her there by accident. He had been listening carefully in town before they left, noticing how certain names repeated themselves in whispers, how certain men spoke loudly about honor while avoiding questions about the past, and how her uncle's confidence seemed less rooted in truth than in fear of something being uncovered. Inside the barn, dust floated through shafts of moonlight as if even the air were waiting. And when the cowboy finally spoke, he told her what he had learned from a drunken ranch hand earlier that evening. That months ago, her uncle had been involved in a quiet dispute over land boundaries, a dispute that had nearly escalated into scandal when documents surfaced showing that part of the Whitfield ranch had been acquired through manipulation rather than lawful purchase. Clara listened in disbelief as the pieces aligned, realizing that the rumors about her had begun soon after those documents had circulated, not because she had done anything wrong, but because her presence had become inconvenient at a time when the family needed a distraction from their own vulnerability. The cowboy explained that towns often sacrificed the innocent not out of cruelty, but out of instinct, because an obvious scapegoat was easier to manage than a complicated truth, and Clara felt anger rise not as rage, but as clarity, because for the first time she saw her exile not as personal failure, but as deliberate strategy. When she asked why her father had allowed it to happen, the cowboy did not answer immediately, and the silence between them carried a heavier weight than words, because both of them understood that complicity was not always malicious. It was often the quiet agreement of people who feared change more than injustice. As the night deepened and the barn creaked around them, Clara realized that her story was no longer hers alone. It had become evidence of a larger lie that threatened the stability of the town itself, and she felt the shift from victim to witness, from exile to someone who could no longer be erased without consequence. Outside, the wind moved through the valley with a low, restless sound, and Clara understood that by uncovering the truth, she and the cowboy had crossed a line far more dangerous than leaving the ranch, because now they were not simply walking away from silence. They were carrying proof that could unravel the fragile peace everyone else had worked so hard to preserve. The reckoning did not arrive with torches or shouting crowds, but with the slow, unavoidable spread of a truth that could no longer be contained, and Clara Whitfield felt its weight long before she saw its effects, because once a lie began to collapse, it rarely did so quietly, even when no one dared to admit it aloud. By morning, whispers in town had shifted in tone, no longer sharp with certainty but brittle with doubt. And as Clara and the cowboy walked back toward the ranch, she sensed that the ground beneath the familiar streets had subtly changed, as if every step now carried questions people had been trained not to ask. The cowboy did not march in triumph or anger. He walked with the steady composure of someone who understood that justice was not something to be demanded loudly, but revealed carefully. And when they reached the yard, they found her uncle standing near the porch, his confidence noticeably thinner, his posture stiff with the awareness that his story was no longer universally accepted. Neighbors gathered again, but this time their faces were not unified in judgment. Some avoided eye contact. Others watched Clara with a curiosity that bordered on unease, because her return had transformed her from a problem to a possibility. The cowboy spoke calmly, laying out the fragments of truth without accusation, describing the land dispute, the forged boundaries, the convenient timing of the rumors about Clara, and with each detail, the silence among the crowd deepened, not with disbelief but with recognition, because the story was too coherent to dismiss. Clara watched her father as the words unfolded, searching his expression for denial or defense. But what she saw instead was something far more painful, understanding, followed by shame, and in that moment she realized that he had never fully believed the accusations against her. He had simply chosen not to challenge them. Her uncle tried to interrupt, insisting that private matters should remain private, that families survived by protecting themselves from external scrutiny. But his arguments sounded weaker now, stripped of the moral certainty they had once carried. And when a neighbor asked quietly whether Clara had truly done anything wrong, no one answered, because the absence of proof had finally become louder than the rumors that had replaced it. The crowd began to disperse, not in outrage, but in discomfort, because admitting injustice required more courage than enforcing it. And as people walked away one by one, Clara felt the strange sensation of being both vindicated and isolated, because truth did not restore belonging instantly. It merely made exclusion harder to justify. When only her family remained, her father stepped forward slowly, his voice unsteady, as he said that they had made a mistake. But the words arrived too late to undo what had already been broken, and Clara understood that the reckoning was not about punishment or revenge. It was about the irreversible shift that occurred when silence was finally forced to speak. As she stood beside the cowboy, feeling the weight of the town's fractured certainty settle into something fragile and uncertain, Clara realized that she had not won a battle or defeated an enemy. She had simply survived long enough for the truth to outlast the lie. And in doing so, she had changed the story of the town forever, without raising her voice or lifting a hand, proving that sometimes the most powerful victories were not those that destroyed opponents, but those that left them alone with the consequences of what they had chosen to believe. The town did not apologize the way Clara Whitfield had once imagined it might, with public admissions or dramatic reversals, and as the days passed, she understood that communities rarely admitted their failures outright, because doing so required confronting not only what they had done, but why they had been willing to do it in the first place. Instead, the change arrived quietly, in the way people began to meet her eyes again, in the hesitation that replaced certainty, and in the subtle shift of conversations that no longer assumed her guilt as fact. Clara returned to the ranch not as a daughter seeking forgiveness, but as a woman who had outgrown the need for permission. And when her father tried to speak with her one evening, his words came slowly, stripped of authority and pride, because he understood that whatever bond they still shared could not be rebuilt through commands or explanations. The cowboy remained near her, without claiming ownership of her story, continuing his work on the outskirts of town with the same quiet discipline that had drawn her attention from the beginning. And in his presence, Clara felt not rescue or dependence, but stability, the rare assurance that someone could stand beside her without trying to rewrite her truth. One afternoon, as the sun lowered over the fields and the air filled with the steady rhythm of horses moving across familiar ground, Clara walked with him beyond the fence line where the land opened into wide, unclaimed space, and there he finally spoke again of the promise he had made days earlier, not to glorify it, but to clarify it, telling her that he had never intended to save her, because saving someone implied superiority, and what he had offered instead was companionship in a world that often mistook silence for virtue. Clara listened quietly, aware that his words were not romantic declarations but deliberate choices, and she realized that the most powerful part of his promise had never been the act of standing against her family. It had been the refusal to decide her worth on their behalf. When she told him that she did not know whether she would ever feel the same connection to the town again, he did not argue or reassure her. He simply said that belonging was not something a place granted, but something people built when they refused to abandon each other at the moment it was easiest to do so. As they stood there, watching the horizon shift from gold to shadow, Clara felt the weight of her past loosen, not because it had disappeared, but because it no longer defined the boundaries of her future. And she understood that the promise he had made had quietly transformed into something far larger than protection. It had become a shared direction, a decision to walk forward without erasing what had been lost. When she finally stepped back towards the ranch beside him, not behind him and not ahead of him, Clara felt a calm she had never known before, because she understood that while her own blood had once turned against her, a stranger's promise had given her something far more enduring than acceptance. A home chosen not by fear or tradition, but by the simple, stubborn refusal to walk away when walking away would have been easier than staying. Her family chose reputation over her life. A stranger chose her over blood. If you were in her place, would you have left or fought for the truth? Subscribe to Native American Tales for stories where courage is quiet but unforgettable.